evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? All right, terrific. Good evening and welcome to William Woods University for a truly unique event tonight. Welcome over for some of you who spent the day here, and welcome to campus for those of you who traveled to be here with us this evening. So thank you for that. For those of you that I haven't had the chance to meet yet, my name is Dr. Jeremy Moreland, and I'm proud to be the 13th president of William Woods University. Thank you for joining us for this evening for what will be a special look back at one of our most memorable moments in the history of our university, the 1952 commencement address by future president at that point, Ronald Reagan. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to recognize some special guests who have joined us tonight. First and foremost, I am thrilled to welcome Senator Jim Talent, who served Missouri in the United States Senate and 4 terms in the U.S. Congress, now serving as chair of the National Leadership Council for the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, perhaps known to you as the Reagan Library, as our keynote speaker tonight. Please join me in thanking him for being here. We're also pleased to have some other esteemed dignitaries with us here as well. So from right here in Callaway County, Representative Jim Schulte. Pleased to have 2 of our longest serving William Woods trustees, Mr. Dale LaRue. There's Dale. And Mr. Charlie James. We're also delighted to have the mayor of Jefferson City, the Honorable Ron Fitzwater. And I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize an important figure in the region as well, and a good friend of mine on air, Mr. Fred Perry. Thanks to all of you for joining us here tonight. So in the 154-year history of William Woods, we've been blessed to have some amazing variety of speakers here on campus, for commencement and otherwise, who have appeared on our campus across the years. But whether it's the authors, the talk show hosts, actors, senators, professional athletes, or singers who have graced us here at the Woods with their presence, no one's visit was more historic and unique in its context than when a Hollywood actor and future two-term U.S. president, not to mention governor as well, named Ronald Reagan, delivered the commencement address to the graduates of William Woods College at the time, on June 2nd, 1952. It was historic because it was one of the first speeches Mr. Reagan, in a public setting, gave where he would lay the groundwork for his future career in politics, all the way up to the most powerful office in the world. It was unique because it was recorded in its entirety, a real rarity in the pre-tape recorder and pre-iPhone world of 1952. And due to both its historic nature and unique circumstance, America the Beautiful, as it was called by Reagan, has been in demand for decades by historians, authors, reporters, and students of American history, but never truly accessed or truly accessible by anyone, or heard by very few at the most, until tonight, nearly 72 years after it was delivered. Upon hearing the future president's words in a few moments, you may find yourself wondering what it was like to sit outdoors in the audience on that warm, sunny, early summer day. In fact, you would have been sitting just a few hundred yards from where you're sitting right now. So for students on campus right now, the visitors lot over by the William Woods Academic Building, that's where you would have been. So picture that, right there by beautiful Senior Lake. Well, fortunately, we know someone who was there, and we'd like to introduce you to her via video right now.
I worked in the Director of Public Relations office. I came in after school, and anytime I could, I typed student letters, when kids wanted to come and they had applied, so I would type the letters out. Then after graduation, I worked here. And so my first job was to type Reagan's speech. It was a beautiful day. And the sun was out, there was a soft breeze, and all the chairs were out in the front of the academic building. And then they had brought the organ out, and beautiful, they sang America the Beautiful. Everybody got to shake his hand and meet him. He was so personable. But the kids were thrilled to death, and Nancy, his wife, she was pregnant with her first child. So that was exciting too for all the kids to see them. It's a beautiful speech. Everybody in America should hear it. It is the most patriotic speech you will ever read.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in recognizing Ms. Pat O'Rourke, 1952 graduate of William Woods College. Pat, thanks for sharing your story. Thanks for continuing on a regular basis to be such an important part of our William Woods community, and we love you. Thanks for being here. So today, as each of us prepare to vote for our local and national leadership in the upcoming election, this being an election year of 2024, long time from when this speech was delivered, it's kind of a key time to reflect on just how fortunate we are to have the right to vote, to debate the merits of leaders and issues, and to speak our minds as Americans. No leader or policy has universal backing in a democratic society as pluralistic as ours, and of course, Ronald Reagan was no different. But few could argue that one of the most consequential presidents of the 20th century was indeed President Reagan. And having a future president articulate how he saw America and the world and Americans in that world nearly 3 decades before he became president in the form of a recording of a commencement address right here on our campus that has become a rare artifact is a downright historical moment. Agreed? All right. And that historical moment is what we commemorate tonight. So, a couple of notes. When the recording begins, the first voice you will hear is the William Woods president at the time, the 9th president of the institution, Tilford Swearingen. It's a $10 handle, right? Great name. The last name you might recognize as a place that you've lived at some point on campus, correct? Indeed. And President Swearingen introduces Mr. Reagan, followed by the future President Reagan himself. We'll have text of the remarks on the big screen so you can follow along visually as well. So just a note, please keep your conversations and talking to a minimum. Voices carry in here, as they always have. And while it's playing, and try to keep those conversations as softly as possible. And a 2024 note, something you didn't have to ask people to do back in '52, if you would please silence your cell phones at this time. All right? So please enjoy, and then we'll have some discussion following. All right? Enjoy the speech.
We selected him not only because of his prominence as a citizen, well known as the 3-time president of the Screen Actors Guild, also because of his outstanding activity in the movie colony in attempting to eradicate the anti-American influences there, in which movement he has taken an active leadership. Because of that, has been called to many places across the country to speak to groups of our citizens, not only because of his ability as an actor, but in addition to all of these, we have asked him to come here to the campus of a Christian college to speak to a group of young women whom we know and whom we love on this graduation day, because of his fine stature as a person and as an American citizen. All of those add up to something that's important, and we believe that he will have something straightforward to say to us in a direct manner out of the great heart of a fine human being and an outstanding professional man in his field. I'm very happy, therefore, to introduce to you or present to you whichever may be appropriate, Mr. Ronald Reagan, who will give our commencement address. Mr. Reagan.
Thank you. President Swearingen, members of the graduating class of 52, your schoolmates, ladies and gentlemen. I was quite moved to hear my presence here being announced as the winning of a gamble. You may feel after you have heard me attempt to speak that by my being here you lost the gamble. I usually very vain about wearing these, but I believe in view of the wardrobe that I can put them on as necessary dressing now. This is a role which, believe me, I approach with more fear than I have ever felt about any role I have played, and certainly with a great humility and a feeling of my unworthiness to participate in this ceremony. When you add to that the fact that less than a generation ago the people of my profession could not even be buried in the churchyard, you can understand why my knees tremble. Of course, do not get encouraged by this and feel that because of my fear you are apt to get off those somewhat uncomfortable chairs early. I once learned the hard way that whether you have anything to say or not, keep talking. I was, as has been pointed out, a sports announcer here in the Midwest, and once upon a time a very noted evangelist from the city of Los Angeles came to our town to hold a series of meetings. An enterprising public relations man thought it would be a good idea if she were interviewed on our radio station. Now, why they should pick a sports announcer to interview the late Amy Semple McPherson, I'll never know. But they did. I asked her a few questions. She answered them graciously, then went into a fervent plea concerning the success of her meetings. I suddenly was horrified to hear her saying good night to our radio audience, and according to the radio clock, there were 4 minutes to go. I stood up. I didn't know enough to fill 4 minutes, that is, that I could put on the air about Miss McPherson. So I did this, which means get a record ready. And a very sleepy lad, as a matter of fact, from your state here, pulled one off a stack of records, threw it on a turntable, nodded, go ahead. And in my most dulcet tones, I said, ladies and gentlemen, we conclude this broadcast by the noted evangelist Amy Semple McPherson with a brief interlude of transcribed music. I expected nothing less than the Ave Maria. The Mills brothers started singing Minnie the Moocher's Wedding Day. Of course, by way of encouragement, I might tell you that age has somewhat tempered this philosophy of keeping talking. Adding to it was an experience related to me by a friend of mine, Bill Alexander, the minister of a Christian church in Oklahoma. He told me of an experience, his first church, when he had become ordained a minister. He went to this little town in Oklahoma. It was an evening ceremony. He'd worked for weeks on his sermon, wanting to make a good first impression. And as he stood up there in the middle of the church was the only member of the congregation who had dared the weather and the hour. One lone little man. So Bill went down and he said, look, I'm just a young preacher trying to get started. He said, you seem to be the only member of the congregation that showed up. Do you think I should go ahead? And the man said, well, I wouldn't know about that sort of thing. He says, I'm just a little old cowpoke out here in Oklahoma, but I do know this. If I loaded up a truckload of hay and took her out on the prairie and only one cow showed up, I'd feed her. So Bill stepped back into the pulpit. And an hour and a half later, having pronounced the benediction, he went down and said, my friends, you seem to have stuck with me. As I told you, I'm just a young preacher trying to get started. What did you think? And the fellow said, well, like I told you, I'm just a little old cowpoke, don't know about that sort of thing, but I do know this. If I loaded up a truckload of hay, took it out in the prairie, and only one cow showed up, I wouldn't give her the whole load. No public speaker should open with an apology for himself or his remarks, but I would rather be known as honest than eloquent. And so I feel a duty bound to inform you that I am going to try to give you some remarks from my mind and heart, but they certainly will not be an address. If I had a text for anything, I'm going to say you have heard it in the opening hymn, America the Beautiful. I know that this is not particularly a fashionable subject. too many tub-thumping politicians on too many 4ths of July have paid word tribute in platitudes to the 4th of July speech of Wave the Flag. And all of us, as we grow older, have a tendency to grow a little more cynical, to find fault, to see the things that should be done. And as we're younger, we're a little impatient with sentiment and emotion. We're a little reluctant to show it. And we're impatient for change, and we want correction of those things that are wrong and should be done. And so perhaps none of us pay enough attention to the very thought behind this land of ours, and that's what I would like to do, if I may, with your indulgence, for a few moments this morning. I have believed, I wish, in the midst of all of the 4th of July speeches, I should say before I wish, that there are those who have spoken eloquently. I wish I had the eloquence and the talent to do it as simply as was done by a very great lady of the theater, Helen Hayes, as that little woman stood before 120,000 people in a patriotic ceremony at Soldiers Field, and so simply and with that God-given talent recited the words that all of us have known since childhood, and yet so few of us have ever really heard. Her address was, she simply said, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring." She had said it all, because it has been said that America is less of a place than an idea. And if it is an idea, and I believe that to be true, it is an idea that has been deep in the souls of man ever since man started his long climb from the swamps. It is nothing but the inherent love within each one of us of freedom. And the great ideological struggle that we find ourselves engaged in today is not a new struggle. It's the same old battle. We met it under the name of Hitlerism, we met it under the name of Kaiserism, and we have met it back through the ages in the name of every conqueror that has ever set upon a course of establishing his rule over mankind. It is simply the idea, the basis of this country, the basis of our religion, the idea of the dignity of man, the idea that deep within the heart of each one of us is something so godlike and precious that no individual or group has a right to impose his or its will upon the people, that no group can decide for the people what is good for the people so well as they can decide for themselves. I, in my own mind, have thought of America as a place that in the divine scheme of things was set aside as a promised land. It was set here, and the price of admission was very simple. The means of selection was very simple as to how this land should be populated. Any place in the world, and any person from those places, any person with the courage, with the desire to tear up the roots, to strive for freedom, to attempt and dare to live in a strange and foreign place, to travel half across the world, was welcome here. And they have brought with them, and to the bloodstream that has become America, that precious courage, the courage that they and they alone in their community, in their nation, in their family had in the first place, to dare the unknown, to strive for something better for themselves and for their children and their children's children. I believe that God, in shedding his grace on this country, has always, in this divine scheme of things, kept an eye on our land and guided it as a promised land for these people. There is a legend that when a group of the fathers of this country were meeting in long debate in Independence Hall regarding the signing of a Declaration of Independence, and as the hours wore on and the talk was filled with the sound of treason, traitors, heads rolling, we shall hang, that at the very peak of this there stood up a man and spoke out, and with his voice all was stilled. And he said, "Sign that document. Sign it if tomorrow your heads roll from the headsman's axe. Sign that document because tomorrow and in the days to come your children and all the children of all the days to come will judge you for what you do this day." And as he went on speaking, his oratory was so great, his words so sincere and so moving, that there was a sudden movement to the front of the room. and the Declaration of Independence was signed. And when the ceremony was completed and they turned to find the man that had swayed the issue, they could not find him. The doors were guarded, and they asked the guards, and no one had seen anyone leave. And no one knows to this day, although his words are recorded, who was the man, nor could they find anyone who had spoken that day and caused that declaration to be signed. Since that day and down through the years, we have seen grow an American personality. We who have within our nation and within ourselves all the bloodstreams of all the national origins in the world know that today there is an American personality, something that stamps us indefinably as what we are. I remember a few years ago on a Sunday afternoon taking a hired automobile out into the countryside of England. I wanted to see the countryside. I'd never been abroad before. And as dusk was falling in a very cold winter day, we came upon a little English tavern, several hundred years old, a pub, if you will, and this I wanted to see. So the driver and I entered. There was a very motherly-looking, large woman standing back of the counter and very few customers as yet. Some way she divined that I was an American, and she started talking, and she said, we had a great many of your lads just across the roadway there during the war. And she started talking about those lads. She said they used to come in here every night and have a song fest. And then as she looked into the distance and her face softened, she said, I remember one Christmas Eve. She says, me and Pop was here all alone. And she said, suddenly the door burst open and in they came. She says they had presents for me and Pop. They called me Mom. She said big strappin' lads they was from a place called Iowa. Well, she had a tear in her eye, and I'm sure I did. Because you and I know those big strapping lads from a place called Iowa. They could have been from a place called Missouri or Indiana or Pennsylvania or Maine or California. They were just American boys, stamped with the indefinable trademark that is America. I think in talking about this personality that is America, someone once during the war marveled that we seem to be the only people that could laugh and fight at the same time. I don't think this stems from any love of fighting. It just stems from the rich, warm humor that comes from the confidence, from the belief in all that is good that is inherent in all of us. And I think it was best illustrated out in a little lonely Pacific island one day. A B-24 came in, buzzed the field, circled, and asked for landing instructions. And suddenly the control tower, as they buzzed the runway, saw a one-star flag painted on the side of this plane. And there was a hasty call for the officer of the day and the commanding officer with the announcement that a general was coming in, a brigadier general. So they hastily mustered the guard, and the officer of the day stood there, and as the plane landed, pulled to a stop, and its crew came forth. The top-ranking man was a youngster about 22 years old. He was a major. And they looked beyond him, and they said, where is the general? And he said, General? There's no general. This is all of us. And they said, but the one-star flag. He said, that's a service flag. Our tail gunner's grandmother works at Lockheed. Some time ago, I sat at a banquet, and the very banquet could just about only take place in this land of ours. It was so American. It was a banquet of the National Conference of Christians and Jews, gathered to present 2 awards for contributions to humanity. One of the awards was going to a Greek immigrant boy who arrived in this country 44 years ago, and today has founded one of the great theatrical fortunes, and is today a member of a family that he and his family are numbered among our greatest philanthropists, the Skouras family. The other award was going to a little man from a faraway land, then wielding the gavel at the United Nations, now the ambassador to this country from the Philippines, General Romulo. In accepting the awards, General Romulo spoke. And it would have been wonderful if all of America could have heard this little man from this far-off land speak to us about our country. And he told us how he saw America, the generosity that was evidenced in those big strapping lads from a place called Iowa, the generosity that has made America the first on the scene wherever disaster strikes throughout the world, that has made America today seeking to rehabilitate the entire world and lead it on a better course. Sure, we rationalize and we try to cover what we are doing by saying, well, it's for our own defense. We have to do this. It is purely selfish on our part. But General Romulo said, including his own people, he doubted if conditions were reversed, if there was any nation in the world that could embark upon such a program to salvage the rest of the world. And then General Romulo spoke of an incident in his own life in which he was flying back at the end of World War II for the establishment of Philippine independence. And they stopped off at Guam. And as they landed there, the Navy base, they were told, why don't you wait a few hours? We are waiting to hear the radio reports from the first atomic bomb explosion at Bikini. And then you can take off and you will be in plenty of time. So they heard that awesome spectacle broadcast by the Navy. And then the next day, we're in Manila. And there, he said, 250,000 of his countrymen gathered in the concourse. Our vice president, senators, representatives, military figures were there. And he said at a given signal, down from the flagpole came the American flag, and up went the flag of the Philippines. And the general said suddenly he realized he was crying. And he felt that all of the 250,000 of his countrymen were crying. And then he asked us. He said, I couldn't help but feel and wonder if 100 years from now, when our children's children open their textbooks, their history books, will they read that on this date we started our experimental detonating of atomic weapons? Or will they read that on this date a great nation, a powerful nation, that had wrested a small foreign country back from the hands of a brutal and powerful aggressor, and in so doing had bled the flower of its youth into the soil of that foreign land, had then for the first time in the history of man's relation to man, had this great government turned to this small country and said, here is your land, take it back. It is said to you and to all of us that this is a man's world. You young ladies are getting ready today to set foot into this man's world. I am not going to take issue with this particular belief or this claim. It's been said for as long as men have controlled the means of saying anything. But a few years ago, following World War II, a new word was coined with regard to this man's world, a term, momism. And many articles were written deploring the influence of the American female on the men of this man's world and blaming them for the fact that a large number of young men had been unable or unwilling to face the test of war in behalf of their country. I'm not going to take issue with this, but if blame is to be attached to the females of our country, if women are going to be blamed under the term of momism for this group of men who could not meet the test, then certainly credit must be due. And credit must be given where it is due. So if momism is responsible for those failures, then momism must have been responsible for the 16 million young men who did meet the test. Momism must have been responsible for the happenings in a B-17 coming back across France from Germany. Disabled by ground fire, losing altitude, they had taken a direct burst in the ball turret hanging underneath the B-17. The ball turret gunner was wounded, and the turret was jammed so that they could not get him out. Finally, the pilot had to order bail out. And as the men started to leave the plane, the trapped, wounded kid in the ball turret knew he was being left behind, and he cried out in terror. Even the dry words of the citation in military language for heroism cannot hide the drama and the nobility of what took place then. The last man to leave the plane saw the co-pilot sit down and take the boy's hand, and he said, "Never mind, son, we'll ride it down together." Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously awarded. Momism must have been responsible for an incident in Italy. A war correspondent friend of mine told me about walking down an Italian road one day, and there at the side of the road, in a small stream, he saw a chaplain baptizing 19 boys. Thinking there might be a story here, he went over, and the chaplain said, "Well, the story here is that youngster over there. He brought the other 18 in." So as they started on down the road, he started talking to the boy. And the boy said, "Wait till my mom hears this." He said, "You know, all my life she was trying to get me to go to Sunday school and church," and he says, "I didn't have time for anything like that. But," he said, "over here you get a little more time to think." And he said, "I started reading that Bible like she'd been telling me about." And he said, it made a lot of sense. So he said, "I talked to the other fellas about it." And he said, "I talked the other 18 into doing this with me." And he said, "I can't wait." He said, "I'm going to write her." He said, "Boy, will she be happy when she hears now she finally won." A short time later, my friend held this boy in his arms while he died. The boy said two things, asked two things. He asked first, "Will you be sure and tell my mom what I did?" And second, he said, "Don't let this happen again." Momism must have been present there. You young ladies are going to embark on many graduation days on through your lives. There's a form of graduation day that marks each one of our passing from one phase of life into another. But none will be more important or linger in your minds more than this. None will be more important from a standpoint of making a decision, of choosing your way. I know it is very easy for all of us to say the events in the world are so large. The happenings of our nation are so great that what can I as an individual do? I have no place in this. This is for people who control the movements of mankind. Well, some time ago I attended a football game, a night football game at the Coliseum in Los Angeles. This is one of the truly great stadiums of our country. 103,000 people were present in that stadium that night. And between halves, they turned off the lights. And suddenly you found yourself in a darkness you could almost feel. And then a voice on the public address system said, "When I give the signal, I'm going to count 3. When I give the signal on 3, each one of us shall light a match." Well, it sounded a little silly, and you didn't think, what can a match do in this darkness, this velvet darkness? But suddenly on the number 3, 103,000 people scratched matches. And there was a warm glow that bathed that field down there below us in light, that battled back the darkness, an arc of light clear up above the stadium. It was one of the most spectacular sights I have ever seen, just because each one of the people there did what he could to contribute a little light. Now, you, in making a choice, in embarking upon a course, can choose a form of momism, because the boys that I have talked about, the boys in the B-17, the boys your age, who tonight or today are standing, I guess it is night there now, in Korea. General Ridgway spoke of their courage, their heroism a few days ago. These are the boys that you are going to marry. You are going to teach and heal and mother their sons. You have an opportunity to decide now whether you will strike a match and whether you will help push back the darkness over the stadium of humanity, or whether you will contribute to the other kind of momism. You have a chance to decide whether to this men's world you will contribute men who will believe in a love of humanity and a love of their fellow man, regardless of race or creed or national origin. And if you embark on the right course and do this, you may bring closer the day when your sons and their sons will not have to prove their worth by bleeding all that they are and all they ever hope to be into the sands of some far-flung beachhead. And now on this day of congratulations to you, I would like, on behalf of all these people around you who have preceded you into the world, I would like to bid you welcome. We need you. We need your youthful honesty. We need your courage. We need your sweetness. And with your help, I am sure we can come much closer to realizing that this land of ours is the last best hope of man on earth. God bless you.
Quite a glimpse back in history. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for the evening.
gamble that I
Jim
spoke
Talent
about
has over 30 years of government and political
to do with the
experience, including service
possibility
in both chambers of Congress.
of Mr.
He's a
Reagan
nationally
coming or
recognized
not
leader
coming.
on military affairs whose counsel
had
is
nothing to
frequently
do with the
sought by
quality of
administrators and
performance.
members of the House and Senate on
I've
both
always been
sides
taught
of the
that
political aisle. During his
a sure
service in the
thing
U.S.
is
Senate
no-
and
is no
U.S. House,
gamble.
Senator Talent served on each chamber's Armed Services Committee, where he
Therefore,
worked to advance a strong
that
national
part
defense and military readiness.
promise of him
Since
coming
leaving the U.S. Senate, Senator
never a
Talent
gamble
has
because
continued his work in
its
government
quality
and
was
policy.
from the beginning.
In addition to serving as chair of the National Leadership Council for the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, he serves as a member of the Defense Policy Council and as a distinguished fellow for the Heritage Foundation. He has also written and co-written numerous articles and essays for publication ranging from the Wall Street Journal to Real Clear Politics, mostly on the subject of military preparedness and foreign affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Senator Jim Talent.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, President Moreland. It was a very kind introduction. It was better than I deserved, but I certainly enjoyed hearing it, so thank you. You know, I was very honored by this invitation to come here today. I look forward to being here. I'm grateful to everybody at William Woods for asking me to come, but you didn't do me any favors by making me follow Ronald Reagan on the platform. That's something I never thought I would have to do in my political career. I'm going to do my best. So to President Moreland, to any of the faculty who are here, to students, to distinguished guests, I want right at the beginning to deliver my main message. It's from all of us who love the Reagan Foundation and Library to all of you who love William Woods University, and it is thank you from the bottom of our hearts for giving us this recording. It's very important to us to have it. The Reagan Library is the international center for the study not just of the Reagan years, but of Ronald Reagan, the man. And by the way, there are a lot of people who are interested in Ronald Reagan. We're the most visited library in the presidential library system. Kind of proud of that. We average 275,000 visitors each year and have over 900,000 followers on our social media channels. So the visitors to our library have, to this point, been able to read the speech he gave here 72 years ago. We have a copy of that speech in our archives, and it's in just the form that you preserved it. It's a copy of your yearbook. But now our visitors will be able to hear the recording as you heard it today, and just as your graduating class heard it when he gave it in the middle of the last century. We do know how important this recording is to you. It represents a really significant moment in the life of this institution, and that makes us all the more grateful to you for giving it to us. So we will cherish it as you do and care for it as you have. Thank you again. With regard to the address itself, it's a quite important part of the Reagan canon, and it's very unusual for what it doesn't contain. There's no policy in the speech. There's a passing reference to the war in Korea and the poignant and powerful stories from World War II, but no comment at all, much less any in-depth discussion of the momentous events occurring in the country and around the world at that time. Now, I can assure you that's not because Ronald Reagan was uninterested in those events. He was a voracious reader with a photographic memory for detail and an avid participant in public affairs throughout the entirety of his adult life. He was a strong New Dealer for all of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency and a strong Democrat for many years after that, including the time he spoke here. He had just stepped down, and the president who introduced him referred to this, he just stepped down from his post as president of the Screen Actors Guild after 5 bruising years of battling both the movie studios, who of course were fighting against better benefits for the actors that Reagan represented, and also the communists who were trying to subvert the guild and extend their influence into Hollywood. By the time he gave this speech, he was well known throughout the country as both a left-wing liberal in his politics and a prominent leader on the anti-communist left. And he was passionate about public affairs. Reagan loved to talk politics and argue policy with anybody who would listen, and sometimes, it has to be said, to people who weren't all that interested. As a matter of fact, his first wife, Jane Wyman, always claimed that she divorced him, and it broke Reagan's heart when she did. About 4 years before he gave the speech, she claimed she divorced him in part because she couldn't stand the way their life together had become dominated by his interest in politics. But I don't want you to think Ronald Reagan was a bore. I mean, I am from the Reagan Library. I can't let you think that. And the opposite really was true. He was popular with his acting peers. He had many friends across the spectrum. His political disagreements were many, but always friendly. He had a natural sense of self-deprecating humor, and it was on full display in this speech. And his charm, warmth, and good nature made him a popular speaker and a sought-after MC at charitable events around the country. But notwithstanding all that, the man who spoke here 72 years ago was certainly a political animal and certainly not shy about proselytizing his politics. But there's none of that in this speech. No facts, no figures, no comment on the presidential election that year, no advocacy for the working man, though he had just served as a union leader, and no real discussion of the communist menace, though in 1952, that would not have been out of place in a commencement speech anywhere, much less in central Missouri. What we have in this address is not a political narrative by a political man, but a meta-narrative from a patriot. A thoughtful citizen at the midpoint of an eventful life, reflecting on the nature of his country, on why he loved America, and what America meant to the people and the world. That's why, after all, he called it America the Beautiful. But what did he mean by that? Americans have always wrestled with the question of whether their country is a proposition nation or a heritage nation, whether it's defined by the ideas on which it was founded or by the shared traditions, history, and experience of its people. So in this speech, Reagan said clearly that it's both. It's a nation created on a simple principle, a self-evident principle, according to America's founders, that every person has organic and equal worth as an individual human being. It's the principle of human dignity, what Reagan called in this speech something godlike and precious deep within the heart of each one of us. He believed that America was founded upon that idea. But he also believed, and you heard it in this speech, that over the generations that idea drew to our shores a peculiar kind of people who had in common not class or ethnicity or history or faith, but rather the courage to live free lives and the confidence to build a great nation that cherished freedom. Then, after the nation had become great, the generosity of spirit to lead the world in the enormous conflicts of the 20th century against the enemies of human dignity. 30 years after he gave this speech, it fell to Ronald Reagan to play the decisive role in the last of those great conflicts against Soviet communism, which remarkably, America was able to win without firing a shot. How did Reagan and America accomplish that? Well, I can assure you volumes have been written on that subject, and they're all available at the Reagan Library. But the answer comes down mostly to this. Reagan tapped the enormous reservoirs of American power He lit a fire in every domain of government policy and every corner of the American spirit, and used the energy it generated to vindicate the cause of freedom and peace. He rekindled the economy by lightening the tax and regulatory burden of government, and produced an economic boom of such size and duration that by itself it re-energized the confidence of the American people in their way of life. He rebuilt the armed forces and recapitalized them with information age technology, so that by the end of his presidency, American power dominated every theater of possible conflict with the Soviet Union. It's important to note here that Reagan didn't do that, didn't rebuild the military in order to win a war with the Soviets. He rebuilt the military in order to prevail without war. You know, the motto, peace with strength, wasn't something Reagan coined. That was the Emperor Hadrian in the 20th century, in the second century. But it was the theme of virtually every one of Reagan's speeches, and he perfected it and retoured it. Most of all, though, Reagan relied on the power of the idea he spoke about here at William Woods. He believed that idea was the strongest tool America had, and he deployed it relentlessly against Soviet communism. He increased funding for Radio Free Europe and directed it to confront Soviet oppression. He supported the Solidarity movement in Poland and worked with the Pope to protect religious freedom in Eastern Europe. In a speech to the British Parliament in 1982, it's an extraordinary speech, he launched the pro-democracy movement worldwide. He raised the visibility of the Helsinki Human Rights Accords and met again and again with human rights activists from around the world. In short, Ronald Reagan hammered so relentlessly at the inhumanity of the Soviet system, what he famously called the evil empire, that by the time he demanded that Mikhail Gorbachev tear down the Berlin Wall, the wall was already tottering. 2 years later, it fell. Collapsed not by the force of arms, but by the power of an idea and the courage of the people who believed in it. A peculiar people, distinguished by their faith in human dignity, the people whom Reagan had called America the Beautiful when he spoke here way back in 1952. You know, the world was astonished when the wall fell, but it's an historical fact that Ronald Reagan was not. He knew all along that we would win. I want to close with a brief reflection on the current times. Last week, I saw a headline from a popular website. It was, "The United States is doomed." I understand the sentiment. I get it. The problems we face at home are immense. The threats we face from abroad are real and growing, and I have never seen our chattering classes, with honorable exceptions to be sure, so divided, so unwilling to engage with each other and bless their hearts so publicly and plainly wrong about so many things. But are these times as uniquely depressing as they seem? What was the condition of the country when Ronald Reagan became president? I may not look it, but I'm old enough to remember those times. Inflation was at 14%. The economy was stagnating. Violent crime was on the rise. Race relations were not good. National confidence was very low. 53 American hostages had been held hostage for 15 months by a new rogue regime in Iran. The nation had just fought a long and unsuccessful counterinsurgency campaign in Vietnam, and a communist adversary was moving aggressively and boasting publicly about the end of democracy and the inevitable decline of the United States. Sound familiar? If you want to know what Ronald Reagan thought about all that, read his first inaugural address. You will hear again and again the echoes of what he said here in 1952. Just as he did here, he went back to the first principles of his country. He said that Freedom and the dignity of the individual have been more available and assured here than in any other place on earth. Just as he did here, he celebrated the American people, the true heroes of the country, the, quote, men and women who raise our food, patrol our streets, man our minds in factories, teach our children, keep our homes, and heal us when we're sick. We the people, he said, this breed called Americans. And just as he did here, he rejected the spirit of pessimism and foresaw a national renewal if we have the courage and conviction to claim it. He said, we're not, as some would have us believe, doomed to an inevitable decline. I do not believe in a fate that will fall on us no matter what we do. I do believe in a fate that will fall on us if we do nothing. So, with all the creative energy at our command, let us renew our determination and our courage and believe that together with God's help, we can and will resolve the problems which now confront us. Reagan ended that speech, his first speech as president, by asking and answering a question we ought to think about today. Why shouldn't we believe we can do great things, he said. After all, we are Americans. Thank you, President Moreland. And from all of us, thank you again for letting us have a piece of your history and ours. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Talent.
You want me here now, right?
One more time, join me in thanking Senator Talent for his remarks.
I stepped on your applause at the end. That's a cardinal sin for a speaker.
We have plenty to offer and genuinely appreciate your remarks and helping place this remarkable piece of history that in some ways seems of the time and in many ways seems of now in a really important context.
Well, I'm not a Reagan scholar. I would not call myself. We have, obviously, Reagan scholars. But when I read the speech that he gave here, it reminded me immediately of the first inaugural, which I had read. And the themes are very, very similar. It's really something. But of course, that's because he was talking about the issues, the principles, the beliefs that were at his core, the kinds of things that don't change over time. So naturally, in his first inaugural, he's going to go back to what really was in his heart.
So key lesson there, being true to yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we've set aside a little time here for some of your questions and some of Senator Talent's answers. So I'd invite you now to if you're, let's see, I'm looking over for a microphone that I thought was, oh, great, thank you, Jennifer. Jennifer's got a roving microphone, so if you'd raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Oh, thank you, Michael, as well. And so put your hand in the air, and we'd be interested to hear your question and Senator Talent's answer with regard to this historic speech and his ability to put it in an important context as well.
I think I answered all their questions.
It's possible.
Hi, I'm Hannah, and I have a question. Was Ronald Reagan planning to go into government after being an actor, or what caused him to go into the government?
You know, I would be surprised. Well, for example, shortly before this speech, the Democrats in California had asked him to run for Congress, and he had turned them down. So, as I said, he was a very, very avid about politics and political affairs. So again, I'm not the kind, it's not like, I really feel like the Reagan scholars who've read all about his early history could be able to tell you that. I would say I would be surprised if it was something he had never thought about. But I don't think he thought about this seriously until he finished his time as the host of General Electric Theater. Now for the young people here, unless you're familiar with the history of TV, in those days, and these were actually pretty good programs, there were a lot of shows where there would be a regular host who would present like a 1-hour program, a drama typically. And Reagan was hired by, and they were sponsored typically by one company. Reagan was hired by the General Electric Theater to sponsor their theater. And he also acted in many of the programs, and he began doing that in 1954, 2 years after he gave this speech. Well, as part of that, General Electric wanted him to travel around the country speaking to their plants and their employees, and he did it, and he really liked it. And he went like on a barnstorming tour for 6 years. He ended up speaking, go and speak at the plant, but he'd also speak at the local civic clubs and everything else. And it was probably during that period of time that he began to conceive the idea of running for office. And that went until 1960, and he ran for governor of California in 1966. So my guess would be that's probably when he did. And his politics began to change somewhat during that period of time as well. It was a very formative period for him. When he spoke here, he was really in a, and I didn't have time, you guys, and I fully understand, didn't want me to go on for half an hour, but it was a curious time in his life here for other reasons. He'd been divorced 4 years before. He had just married his second wife, Nancy Davis. And unlike Jane Wyman, she was very interested in the politics. So in other words, his personal life had been settled. He had just left as president of the Screen Actors Guild. Television was encroaching on Hollywood, and he was thinking about what his professional career was going to be like. And so when I said it was a thoughtful man at the midpoint of an eventful life reflecting, I really meant that. And you got that here.
So you were kind of shy on the characterizing the 80s economy. Actually, Paul Volcker had raised rates to over 20%. Mortgage rates were double digits, and it threw the economy into a nasty recession. What did Reagan do to imagine to not only win the election, but also come out with a landslide?
You mean 1980 or 84? Well, it's an interesting question. The question was, what did he do to win such a landslide in 1980? Well, the country wanted a change. Now, whenever, I'll speak as a politician here, whenever you're running against an incumbent, particularly a presidential incumbent, the sine qua non, I mean, the threshold question is, do they not want to give, are they looking for a change? Because if they're pretty satisfied with how things are going, they're going to reelect the incumbent. They voted for him once before. Well, people were not happy for the reasons I indicated. And you're right, inflation had been higher than 14%. I think it was at 14% when he ran in 1980, but I Googled it. If it's wrong, I'm sorry. But it was high. Inflation was very high. So I think Reagan just presented an alternative, and he was a very charismatic and likable campaigner. And I think the more people saw of him, the more comfortable they felt with entrusting him with the change. And I remember at the time, the polls really moved in the last few weeks. And it was one of those pretty rare instances when a moment in a debate probably really did have a huge impact on the election. Most debates don't. As a person who's done it like 15 times in high-profile races, most of the time when you debate somebody and they poll it, the people who support you thought you won, and the people who support your opponent thought your opponent won. But there was the last presidential debate where Carter accused Reagan of wanting to destroy Social Security, and Reagan looked at him and he said, well, there he goes again. And it sort of capsulized both who Reagan was and who Carter was, who was a very decent guy, but Carter was, I think people got the sense over the time of his presidency he just wasn't up to it. And the sense of humor reassured people that Reagan was.
Sorry. My question is more specifically towards you.
Yeah.
What got you interested in Reagan, and what made you want to become involved with the Reagan Library?
Yeah. Well, I have, since I left the Senate, or actually I should say I was asked to leave politics by the people of Missouri in 2006. So I always had a big interest in national security affairs, and in particularly the condition of the armed forces. And so I've worked with a lot of think tanks on that, the Bipartisan Policy Center, Heritage you mentioned, AEI. And the Reagan Institute was taken over by a fellow that I knew and had worked with for many years. He was a top staffer on the House Armed Services Committee. And he wanted me to co-chair a task force with a former deputy secretary of Defense named Bob Work on the National Security Innovation Base. And I did that, and Bob and I produced a report on that. And I enjoyed it so much that I wanted to work with the Reagan Institute. And I really like it. And it's great because the Reagan name still has enormous what we call convening power. The ability to bring in people from across the spectrum, to have them actually sit down, engage with each other, talk, and try and produce something useful for the country. And people will do that under the banner of Ronald Reagan and the Reagan Institute. So it's really an extraordinary opportunity for me, and I've enjoyed it. But a lot of it was personal. I knew this man who's running the Reagan Institute, and I really liked him. I'm old enough now that I don't really do a lot unless if I don't want to do it. So.
Can you talk a little bit about how influential Nancy Reagan was in the decisions he made?
Yeah, she was tremendous. And as a matter of fact, and she replaced a first lady who was very influential, Rosalind Carter, who got kind of a bad rap. I thought Rosalind was a great. So first of all, just as with any partnership, her willingness to support him in good times and bad, it was really important, And I tell if any of you are interested in running for office and you are married or you have a partner, they really need to be supportive. At minimum, they need to not resent it, okay? And I've still a lot of candidates, if the wife or the husband is going to resent every day you go out campaigning, don't do it. And she was extremely supportive. The other thing she did, and this is a role that it's important for first ladies to play, okay? Because the presidents tend to get isolated. You have to really work against that. And particularly as time goes on, they tend to be told what they want to hear. As a matter of fact, this is true for anybody who's in an office where you are treated like the boss. I mean, this was the truth for me when I was in Congress. And you need to have people around you who will look you in the eye and tell you when you're going off the rails. And if you think about it, who is a person who can do that, who cannot be walled off, who can get to you if he or she wants to get to you? And my wife deflated me a few times. I remember one time I was ranting and raving about something going on, and she said, "Yes, Jim, wouldn't it be great if only everybody would just agree with you all the time about everything?" And there are other times and you can't wall off the spouse, right? And Nancy did that. There were times when they had to reshuffle the inner White House staff when Don Reagan had all kinds of issues. She would get involved at that point to protect the president. And she was trusted also by all the inner staff, which is not always the case. Okay, so the role is actually a pretty important one, even though it's obviously very informal. Fred.
First of all, Senator Talent, thank you for your eloquent remarks tonight. We appreciate you being here. But since we have you, how would you characterize the readiness of America's military today?
Well, the good news is that we really do. The mature volunteer force, which we have, it is, in terms of the quality of the personnel, the finest in the world. The most capable of thinking independently, of acting jointly, of fighting. I mean, if you look at the array of missions that they have to be prepared to fight, obviously in competitive environments, obviously anywhere around the world, it's stunning. But having said that, okay, the force is too small, particularly the Navy. The inventory is aging and out of date, and there are important theaters of the world and important missions where we cannot where the force, in my opinion, cannot protect the security of the United States within an acceptable margin of risk. That's a Pentagonese way of putting it, but it's important to put it that way. In other words, we are running too high a risk, for example, in the Indo-Pacific. And every commander at Indo-PACOM, which is the combatant command there, has been saying it now going back to almost 10 years. And this is why there is a high risk of conflict over Taiwan. I've actually spoken about this. If there's a flat, you know, Reagan won the Cold War without ever, well, the United States did in general. We never had to shoot at the Soviets and them at us. He didn't have any wars at all, okay? That's what you don't want. The definition of strategic failure is when a president is faced with only two options: either giving up an interest that is vital or initiating an escalating armed conflict with a peer competitor. The whole Cold War was about avoiding, at minimum, if you couldn't do anything else, don't suffer some terrible loss that compromises the security of the country, or in order to prevent the loss, have to engage in escalating armed conflict with a peer competitor, right? Think about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy had another option. He could blockade Cuba. That meant the Soviets had to shoot first. They weren't willing to do that, so they backed down. He had the option because the Navy had that capability. Now, I greatly fear that if the Chinese start something over Taiwan, we're going to be in a position where either they're able to do to Taiwan what they did to Hong Kong, which would, I can tell you, be a tremendous blow to us. I mean, the Allies, that's one of the reasons they want to do it. Or we have to shoot first at China under circumstances that are very unfavorable for the country. You see the definition of strategic failure. You want to be planning and maneuvering so you're not put in that position. And a big part of the reason is that we do not have enough presence in the Indo-Pacific to be able to do what we did in the Cold War. In other words, to sort of do tit for tat at a lower level and deter them and show them. We are outnumbered in ships west of Hawaii 5 to 1. Okay? The Navy, Reagan built the Navy up to 560 ships. It's half that now. It's smaller than at any time since before World War I. Basically since before we became a world power. So I could rant and rave about that, but you've been too good. That'd be a terrible return to your kindness. But if you want to talk about it, well, give me a call. We'll do an interview sometime. I'm happy to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you all again.
Thank you, Fred, for the question. Thank you again, Senator Talent. Thanks so much for joining this evening. And the university has a small token of our appreciation to commemorate your remarks this evening and joining us. So thank you so much for that. And maybe we can get a photo if we get the right angle. Thank you, sir. Yeah, absolutely, right? Isn't that art wonderful? So we've had that around campus, and it's part of the fun.
Do I have to give this to the library, or can I?
No, it's all yours. You take it home. We're not going to tell them anything. So, thank you again. We appreciate it. We'd be honored if you took it home and
I will. Thank you.
And put it in your home office or someplace that you'd enjoy it. So, a couple of remarks here, just as we finish up this evening. And again, thank you so much. I hope you've learned something. I hope you've found something entertaining as well. And I hope that maybe you've thought of something that'll make you think as well, because that's ultimately what we're up to as a university, right? So some final remarks here before we conclude. One more announcement that Senator Talent signaled in his remarks as well. So for decades, this recording of this 1952 Ronald Reagan commencement address at William Woods was stored in our library, hidden away where generations of citizens could not readily access it. And we do not want that to be the case as we press on into the future. And that is why tonight we're really proud to be officially announcing that we are donating the original vinyl records. That speech was on two 45s. For those of you who aren't familiar with 45s, those are the early vinyl streaming devices. Original vinyl recordings of the speech to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute located in Simi Valley, California. This will help ensure that future historians, authors, journalists, and all of those who are interested in U.S. history will always have a way of accessing it flawlessly. And we hope we'll always inextricably link this remarkable American president with William Woods University. So we're happy to do this and to help keep one of the most memorable moments in the history of William Woods alive forever. So I hope you find that exciting and energizing, and I thank each of you so much for coming this evening. Thanks for your participation and your attention and your questions, that whether you spoke them out loud, so thanks for those, or whether you're carrying them on with you. As a university, we're always proud to send you away with a question that maybe you didn't come to a session with. So, and I'm always happy to visit anytime you'd like to chat. So I'll be here all night, I'll be here all week, so happy to chat anytime you'd like to. That said, have a great evening, thanks for coming, and good night.